Or consider the mysterious figure known only as the Syrian woman, whose exotic origin was apparently part of her appeal to Roman clients. References to her appear throughout the city, suggesting she developed a significant reputation and possibly accumulated considerable wealth. The Syrian woman represents the international nature of Pompeii's intimate trade, which drew workers from across the Mediterranean world. These personal stories matter because they remind us that we're not just studying an abstract historical phenomenon. We're examining the lives of real people who navigated complex social and economic systems, made difficult choices, and found ways to survive and sometimes thrive in circumstances that were often beyond their control. But understanding these individual stories requires understanding the larger system they were part of. Roman attitudes towards intimacy were shaped by concepts of power, status, and social hierarchy that are fundamentally different from modern Western values. In Roman society, intimate activity wasn't primarily about love, pleasure, or personal fulfillment. It was about power and social positioning. Who you could be intimate with, how, and under what circumstances were all determined by your place in the social hierarchy. Freeborn Roman citizens had rights and protections that slaves and foreigners didn't possess. Men had privileges that women couldn't access. The wealthy had options that the poor could never afford. This creates a complex moral landscape that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories of right and wrong, consensual and exploitative, empowered and victimized. Some women in Pompeii's intimate trade clearly operated with considerable independence and accumulated significant wealth. Others were trapped in circumstances of brutal exploitation with no possibility of escape. Understanding this moral complexity becomes even more crucial when we examine the legal framework that governed Pompeii's intimate trade. Roman law didn't prohibit such commerce, but it did create elaborate regulations that reveal the contradictions at the heart of Roman society. The legal code distinguished between different types of intimate commerce based on the social status of the participants. A freeborn Roman woman who engaged in such work would lose her citizenship rights and be classified as infamous, legally disgraced. She couldn't marry a Roman citizen, couldn't inherit property in the normal way, and couldn't testify in court. But an enslaved woman engaging in the same activities was simply fulfilling the economic function assigned to her by her owner. This legal distinction created a strange paradox. Women like Claudia Fortunata, whose tombstone was discovered in Pompeii's necropolis, navigated these regulations with remarkable skill. Claudia had been born free, but family financial troubles forced her into this work. Rather than accepting the legal consequences, she found a way to maintain her citizenship by technically operating as a tavern keeper rather than direct service. Claudia's Tavern, located on one of Pompeii's busiest streets, served food and wine during the day and offered more intimate services after dark. The legal fiction allowed her to avoid the most severe penalties while still operating in the trade. Her tombstone, erected by grateful former employees, describes her as a beloved patron who helped other women navigate similar circumstances. But Claudia's story also reveals the constant threat that hung over women in her position. City records show that she was arrested multiple times for violating regulations about when and where certain activities could take place. Each arrest meant fines, and accumulated violations could result in exile or worse. The stress of constant legal jeopardy took its toll, and Claudia died young, probably in her early 30s. The regulations extended beyond individual workers to the physical spaces where the trade operated. Roman law required that certain activities be conducted in designated areas away from temples, schools, and respectable residential neighborhoods. This created distinct entertainment districts, and Pompeii had several. The largest was located near the harbor, where sailors and merchants created steady demand for entertainment. This district included not just intimate establishments, but also taverns, gambling houses, and small hotels. The buildings were constructed with specific features mandated by law: separate entrances for different types of businesses, soundproofing between rooms, and windows positioned to provide privacy from the street. Walking through this district would have been an assault on the senses. The narrow streets were packed with people at all hours. Music spilled from taverns, the smell of cooking food mixed with perfumes and incense. And vendors hawked everything from wine to exotic delicacies imported from across the empire. In the middle of this chaos stood the establishment run by Asalina, probably the most successful businesswoman in Pompeii's entertainment industry. Asalina owned multiple properties, employed dozens of workers, and had business relationships with some of the city's wealthiest families. Her main establishment was a combination tavern, hotel, and intimate house that could accommodate over 100 clients simultaneously. What made Asalina extraordinary wasn't just her business success, but her political involvement. Graffiti found throughout Pompeii shows that she actively campaigned for local political candidates, using her influence and resources to support politicians who favor policies beneficial to her industry. One inscription reads, "Asalina and her girls support Marcus Cyrenius for edile." Asalina's political activities weren't unusual. The intimate trade was so economically important to Pompeii that politicians couldn't afford to ignore it. Tax revenues from these businesses helped fund public works projects, religious festivals, and municipal services. The trade also provided employment, directly and indirectly, for hundreds of people. But Asalina's story takes a dark turn when we examine the working conditions in her establishment. Archaeological evidence suggests that while she lived in luxury, many of her employees endured harsh circumstances. The rooms where workers lived were tiny, poorly ventilated, and showed signs of constant overcrowding. Medical evidence from skeletal remains indicates high rates of disease, malnutrition, and physical trauma. This contrast between Asalina's success and her workers' suffering illustrates one of the most troubling aspects of Pompeii's intimate trade. The system created opportunities for some to accumulate wealth and power, but only by exploiting others who had no alternatives. The exploitation becomes even more apparent when we examine the ages of the workers. Roman law permitted the intimate use of slaves from age 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Skeletal analysis of remains found in Pompeii's establishments suggests that many workers began their careers as children and rarely lived past 30. Consider the case of Fortunata, whose skeleton was found in a small room behind one of the city's taverns. Bone analysis indicates she was approximately 13 when she died, probably from complications related to childbirth. Scratched into the wall beside her bed was a single word: Mama. This heartbreaking discovery reminds us that behind the economic, statistics, and legal regulations were real children, torn from their families and forced into circumstances no human being should endure. Yet even within this system of exploitation, we find evidence of resistance, adaptation, and occasionally triumph. The graffiti in Pompeii's establishments includes messages that suggest workers found ways to maintain dignity and human connection despite their circumstances. One inscription found in the Lupana reads, "Sabina, you please well, but you charge too much." Below it, in different handwriting, someone added, "Sabina says you get what you pay for." This exchange suggests that some workers maintained enough agency to negotiate prices and defend their professional reputation. Another fascinating example comes from a small establishment near the amphitheater where archaeologists found a room decorated entirely by one of the workers. The frescoes depict not intimate scenes, but images of freedom, birds in flight, open doors, distant mountains. The artist, whose name we'll never know, created a private world of hope and imagination within the confines of her physical imprisonment. These small acts of resistance and self-expression become even more poignant when we consider the broader social context. Roman society was built on the assumption that some people existed primarily to serve the pleasure and convenience of others. Slaves, foreigners, and the poor were considered fundamentally different from freeborn Roman citizens, with fewer rights to bodily autonomy, personal dignity, and self-determination. This social hierarchy wasn't just theoretical. It was enforced through law, custom, and violence. Workers in Pompeii's intimate trade who tried to leave their positions illegally could be hunted down and severely punished. Those who became pregnant were expected to continue working until the very end, and their children automatically became slaves, unless special arrangements were made. But the hierarchy also created unexpected opportunities. Some workers used their intimate access to wealthy and powerful clients to gather information, build networks, and accumulate resources that could eventually purchase freedom or protection. Marcus Appius Sabinus, a wealthy wool merchant, maintained a long-term relationship with a woman named Tyche, who worked in one of the harbor district establishments. Their relationship, documented in letters found in Marcus' house, evolved from commercial to personal over several years. Marcus eventually purchased Tyche's freedom, married her in a private ceremony that wasn't legally recognized but was socially accepted, and included her in his business operations. Tyche's story represents one of the few documented cases of someone completely escaping the intimate trade through a personal relationship. But her letters reveal the psychological complexity of her situation. Even after gaining her freedom, she struggled with feelings of shame and uncertainty about her place in respectable society. Her relationship with Marcus was genuine, but it was also built on the foundation of their original commercial transaction. The economic relationships were equally complex. Pompeii's intimate trade operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the street level, individual transactions involved small amounts of money, often just enough to buy a meal or a cup of wine. But at the ownership level, successful establishments generated enormous profits that were invested in real estate, shipping, manufacturing, and other legitimate businesses. This economic integration meant that Pompeii's intimate trade wasn't separate from the mainstream economy, but was woven throughout it. The leather goods sold in the forum were often manufactured by workers who also provided intimate services. The wine served at respectable dinner parties was produced on estates that used profits from establishments to fund expansion. The beautiful frescoes that decorated wealthy homes were painted by artists who also created explicit advertisements. For less respectable establishments, this interconnected economy created a web of complicity that extended far beyond the obvious participants. Senators who publicly condemned vice privately collected rent from properties in the entertainment district. Priests who preached about moral purity invested temple funds in businesses that generated profits from the trade. Even the city's most respectable matrons wore jewelry and silk clothing purchased with money that could be traced back to these establishments. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Graffiti found near the forum includes satirical comments about prominent citizens and their business interests. One inscription mockingly refers to Gaius Cuspius Pansa, a wealthy politician, as the senator who profits from sin while preaching virtue. Another suggests is that Marcus Halconius Rufus, who funded the construction of a theater, used money earned from entertaining the masses in more ways than one. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Pompeii's intimate trade was how it reflected broader Roman attitudes about power, pleasure, and human value. The Romans didn't see intimacy as inherently shameful, but they did believe that intimate roles should reflect social hierarchies. A free Roman citizen was expected to be dominant, never submissive. A wealthy person could purchase intimate services, but providing them was degrading. A man could visit establishments without losing respectability, but a woman engaging in the same behavior faced social exile. These attitudes created bizarre contradictions that played out daily in Pompeii's streets. Consider the case of Lucius Caecilius, a young aristocrat from a prominent family who became infatuated with a male slave named Ganymedes, who worked in one of the city's more exclusive establishments. Lucius visited regularly, spent enormous sums, and even wrote love poetry that was later found carved into the walls of Ganymedes' room. But when Lucius's father discovered the relationship, the scandal wasn't about the same gender aspect, which was socially acceptable for a Roman man as long as he remained the dominant partner. The problem was that Lucius had fallen in love, had allowed himself to become emotionally vulnerable to someone of inferior social status. This violated fundamental Roman principles about how power should flow in intimate relationships. The father's solution reveals the cold calculation that governed such matters. Rather than simply forbidding the relationship, he purchased Ganymedes, freed him, and then arranged for him to disappear from the city. Lucius was married off to a respectable young woman within a month. The emotional devastation this caused both young men was considered irrelevant compared to maintaining proper social order. Ganymedes' fate remains a mystery, but similar stories throughout Pompeii suggest that such disappearances weren't uncommon. The intimate trade created intense personal connections that threatened established hierarchies, and those connections were ruthlessly severed when they became inconvenient for powerful people. Yet within these constraints, some individuals managed to carve out spaces of genuine agency and connection. The establishment run by a woman known as Semira the Egyptian provides a fascinating example of how foreign origin could sometimes be transformed into commercial advantage. Semira had been brought to Pompeii as a slave, probably captured during one of Rome's military campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean. But instead of being assigned to agricultural labor or domestic service, she was placed in an establishment because her exotic appearance and mysterious cultural background appealed to Roman fantasies about foreign women. Over time, Semira learned to manipulate these fantasies for her own benefit. She cultivated an image as a sorceress and fortune teller, claiming to possess ancient Egyptian wisdom about love, intimacy, and the future. Clients came not just for intimate services, but for magical potions, prophecies, and exotic rituals that Semira invented based on half-remembered fragments of her childhood culture. The performance was so successful that Semira eventually saved enough money to purchase her freedom and establish her own business. Her house, discovered in a residential area rather than the traditional entertainment district, was decorated with authentic Egyptian artifacts mixed with Roman intimate art. The combination created an atmosphere of mysterious sensuality that attracted wealthy clients willing to pay premium prices for unique experiences. But Semira's story also illustrates the psychological costs of such success. Letters found in her house, written in a mixture of Latin and Greek, revealed deep loneliness and cultural displacement. She had achieved financial independence and social respectability of a sort, but at the cost of commodifying her own cultural identity and maintaining a persona that grew increasingly distant from her authentic self. The pressure of constant performance took its toll on many workers, regardless of their level of success. Archaeological evidence suggests high rates of mental distress, self-medication with alcohol and substances, and early death from what modern medicine would recognize as stress-related illnesses. The remains of Julia Felix, found in what appears to have been a self-inflicted death, illustrate this tragic pattern. Julia had been one of Pompeii's most successful companions, with wealthy clients throughout the region and property investments that made her genuinely wealthy. But her private writings, preserved by volcanic ash, reveal crushing anxiety about aging, losing her looks, and being discarded by clients who could always find younger alternatives. Julia's final letter, addressed to a sister living in Rome, describes the unbearable pressure of maintaining her appearance and performance while watching younger competitors arrive daily from across the empire. She writes, "I am 31 years old, which might as well be 60 in this business. Every morning I look in the mirror and see new lines, new signs that my value is diminishing. How long before they stop coming? How long before I am forgotten?" The letter was never sent. Julia's body was found beside it, along with an empty vial that had contained a substance common in antiquity. Her death represents the dark side of what appeared to be success within the system, yet not all stories ended in tragedy. Some workers found ways to transition out of the intimate trade and into different roles within Roman society. The case of Drusilla, a former slave who became a successful tavern owner, shows how entrepreneurial skill and careful networking could create genuine opportunities for social mobility. Drusilla had worked in several of Pompeii's establishments before saving enough money to rent a small tavern near the city's main gate. Rather than trying to compete with established businesses, she created a niche serving travelers who needed lodging, meals, and information about the city. Her background in the intimate trade actually proved advantageous because she understood the entertainment industry and could direct visitors to appropriate establishments, while maintaining her own respectability. Over time, Drusilla's tavern became an unofficial information center where merchants, travelers, and local residents came to exchange news, conduct business, and socialize. She reinvested her profits in the business, expanding the building and hiring employees who were themselves trying to transition out of intimate work. Drusilla's success wasn't just personal. She created a model that other women followed, establishing a network of businesses that provided alternatives to direct participation in the trade, while still serving the broader entertainment economy. These businesses operated in the gray area between respectability and vice, offering services that respectable establishments couldn't provide, while maintaining enough legitimacy to avoid constant legal harassment. The network included women like Secunda, who operated a small hotel that catered to couples seeking privacy for extramarital affairs, and Tertia, who ran a shop selling cosmetics, perfumes, and aphrodisiacs imported from across the Mediterranean. These businesses required insider knowledge of the intimate trade, but allowed their operators to maintain social respectability and legal protection. The success of this network demonstrates that Pompeii's intimate trade wasn't just about exploitation and victimization. It was also about economic opportunity, social mobility, and the creation of alternative spaces where people excluded from mainstream society could build lives and communities. But these success stories shouldn't obscure the fundamental brutality of the system. For every Drusilla or Zamira who managed to achieve independence, there were dozens of workers who remained trapped in circumstances of exploitation and abuse until their deaths. The skeletal remains found throughout Pompeii's establishments tell a story of systematic violence that went far beyond the intimate exploitation. Many skeletons show evidence of repeated injuries consistent with physical punishment. Malnutrition was common, suggesting that workers were fed barely enough to maintain their ability to work. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. Perhaps most disturbing are the remains of children and adolescents found in these establishments. Roman law may have permitted the intimate use of young slaves, but the physical evidence suggests that many died from injuries and illnesses directly related to this treatment. These weren't abstract legal concepts, but real children whose lives were destroyed by adult greed and cruelty. The discovery of infant remains in several locations suggests that pregnancy and childbirth in these establishments were often fatal for both mother and child. Without adequate medical care or nutrition, complications that might have been manageable elsewhere became death sentences. Those infants who survived faced immediate enslavement and eventual entry into the same system that had destroyed their mothers. This cycle of exploitation was maintained through a combination of economic incentives, legal structures, and social attitudes that dehumanized certain categories of people. Slaves weren't considered fully human under Roman law, so their suffering was legally irrelevant. Foreigners were assumed to be naturally inferior, making their exploitation seem justified. The poor were blamed for their circumstances, as if poverty were evidence of moral failure rather than systemic inequality. These attitudes weren't unique to the intimate trade, but permeated every aspect of Roman society. The same legal and social structures that permitted intimate exploitation also supported the gladiatorial games, agricultural slavery, and military conquest that were central to Roman civilization. The establishments of Pompeii were just one manifestation of a broader system built on the assumption that some people existed primarily to serve the pleasure and convenience of others. Yet, within this system, moments of genuine humanity persisted. The graffiti found throughout Pompeii's establishments includes not just crude commercial messages, but also expressions of love, friendship, and mutual support among workers. One inscription reads, "Sisters in sorrow, sisters in hope." Another says, "Tomorrow will be better than today." These messages remind us that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people found ways to maintain connections, offer comfort, and preserve dignity. The workers in Pompeii's establishments weren't just victims or commodities, but complex human beings who responded to their circumstances with the full range of human emotions and behaviors. Their stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. They also serve as warnings about what happens when societies construct elaborate justifications for treating certain groups of people as less than fully human. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius on that August day in 79 AD didn't just preserve buildings and artifacts. It froze in time an entire social system, complete with all its contradictions, cruelties, and occasional moments of grace. The ash that buried Pompeii also buried the stories of people like Fortunata, Tyche, Drusilla, and countless others whose names we'll never know. But their stories continue to speak to us across nearly 2,000 years, challenging us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, exploitation, and human dignity. They remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we'd like to believe, and that the most revealing aspects of any society are often found in the shadows rather than in monuments and official records. As we continue to excavate and study Pompeii's remains, we're not just uncovering ancient history. We're examining the consequences of social systems that reduce human beings to commodities, that justify exploitation through legal and religious frameworks, and that allow suffering to persist as long as it remains profitable for those in power. The preservation of these stories becomes even more powerful when we consider how close they came to being lost forever. The morning of August 24th, 79 AD, started like any other day in Pompeii. Workers in the entertainment district woke up, prepared for another day of serving clients, managing businesses, and navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed their lives. None of them knew they had less than 12 hours left. Archaeological evidence suggests that many establishments were operating normally when the eruption began. Coins found scattered on floors indicate that transactions were taking place. Meals were being prepared in kitchens. Beds were occupied. The business of human desire and commercial exploitation was proceeding exactly as it had for decades. But as the mountain began to rumble and ash started falling, the carefully constructed social order that governed Pompeii's intimate trade began to collapse. Suddenly, the hierarchies that seemed so permanent and natural revealed themselves to be fragile human constructions that meant nothing in the face of natural disaster. Consider what happened at Asalina's establishment. When the eruption began, social conventions would normally have required that free citizens be evacuated first, then freed slaves, then property slaves last. But archaeological evidence suggests that in the chaos and terror of that day, such distinctions became meaningless. Bodies found huddled together in the building's basement include people from every social class, clinging to each other without regard for status or previous relationships. The remains of Asalina herself were found in a small storage room, clutching what appears to be a bag of coins and jewelry. But beside her was the skeleton of a young woman whose dental analysis suggests she was one of Asalina's workers in their final moments. The successful businesswoman and the exploited slave faced death as equals. Their previous relationship transformed by shared terror into something approaching human solidarity. This pattern repeats throughout the archaeological record. In establishment after establishment, the rigid social hierarchies that governed daily life dissolved as people faced the reality of imminent death. Masters and slaves, clients and workers, Romans and foreigners all became simply human beings trying to survive an incomprehensible catastrophe. The Lupanar tells a particularly haunting story. 9 bodies were found in the building, but only 3 were in the tiny cubicles where workers normally spent their time. The others were discovered in what had been common areas, suggesting that as the danger became apparent, people abandoned their assigned spaces and came together for comfort and protection. One of the most poignant discoveries was made in the building's upper level, where archaeologists found the remains of 2 people who had died holding hands. Skeletal analysis indicates one was a young woman, probably a worker, and the other was a middle-aged man who might have been a client, an owner, or simply someone who had sought shelter. Their identities don't matter, as much as their final act of human connection. In the face of overwhelming terror, the graffiti that covers the Lupanar's walls takes on new meaning when we consider that some of it might have been carved during those final hours. Among the usual commercial messages and crude boasts, archaeologists have found what appear to be prayers, final messages to loved ones, and desperate pleas for divine intervention. One inscription, carved with a trembling hand, reads simply, "God's help us all." But the volcanic ash that ended so many lives also created an unprecedented historical record. The same geological forces that brought death and destruction also preserved details about daily life in ancient Pompeii that would normally have been lost to time. We can see exactly what people were doing, wearing, eating, and feeling at the moment when their world ended. This preservation allows us to understand the intimate trade, not as an abstract historical phenomenon, but as a lived reality involving real people with real hopes, fears, and relationships. The woman whose skeleton was found clutching a small bronze mirror wasn't just a worker or a slave. She was someone who cared about her appearance, who had personal possessions that mattered to her, who faced death with the same human dignity as any other person. The preservation also reveals details that challenge many modern assumptions about ancient intimacy and gender roles. Recent analysis of skeletal remains suggests that Pompeii's intimate trade included more diversity than historians previously understood. Bodies found in establishments include people who appear to have been born male but lived as women, individuals whose bone structure suggests they may have been intersex, and evidence of surgical modifications that might have been performed to alter physical appearance for commercial purposes. This biological diversity was reflected in the services advertised throughout the city. Graffiti and artwork suggest that Pompeii's establishments catered to an enormous range of desires, fantasies, and intimate practices. Some of these practices would be familiar to modern audiences, while others seem bizarre or disturbing by contemporary standards. The establishment run by a woman, known as Cecilia Ioconda, specialized in theatrical performances that combined intimacy with entertainment. Clients didn't just purchase intimate services, but elaborate fantasy scenarios involving costumes, role-playing, and scripted interactions. Cecilia employed actors, musicians, and artists alongside traditional intimate workers, creating experiences that blurred the line between theater and commerce. Archaeological evidence from Cecilia's establishment includes masks, costumes, musical instruments, and scripts written on wax tablets. The performances range from relatively tame romantic scenarios to elaborate mythological reenactments, involving multiple participants and complex narratives. Clients could choose to be spectators or participants, and the most expensive options allowed them to essentially direct their own personalized productions. This theatrical approach to intimacy reveals something important about Roman culture that pure historical texts often miss. The Romans didn't just consume intimate services. They consumed intimate fantasies, elaborate narratives that allowed them to temporarily inhabit different identities and experience desires that their normal social roles wouldn't permit. Marcus Lucretius, a wealthy but physically disabled veteran, became a regular client at Cecilia's establishment, not because he needed basic intimate services, but because he craved the fantasy scenarios that allowed him to imagine himself as a powerful warrior or successful lover. The scripts found in his house, apparently written for private performances, reveal touching vulnerability beneath his public persona as a successful businessman and respected citizen. Marcus' favorite scenario involved playing a gladiator who wins the love of a beautiful captive princess. The script is surprisingly sophisticated, with genuine character development and emotional depth. For Marcus, who walked with a severe limp from a war injury and had never married, these performances provided not just intimate gratification, but emotional fulfillment and temporary escape from the limitations of his physical reality. The relationship between Marcus and the actress who usually played the princess, a woman called Fortunata Prima, evolved over several years from purely commercial to something approaching genuine affection. Their correspondence, preserved in Marcus' house, reveals a complex emotional connection that transcended their original business relationship. Fortunata Prima wrote to Marcus about her dreams of leaving the theater and opening a small shop selling cosmetics and perfumes. Marcus responded with detailed business advice and eventually provided the financial backing for her venture. Their letters suggest that their relationship became a source of mutual support and genuine care, even though it remained grounded in the commercial transaction that had brought them together. This transformation from commercial to personal relationships appears to have been more common than historians once believed. Throughout Pompeii, archaeologists have found evidence of long-term connections between intimate workers and clients that evolved into something resembling friendship, mentorship, or even affection. The house of Gaius Valerius Venustus contains letters from a woman called Myrtis, who had worked in one of the harbor district establishments for several years. The correspondence spans nearly a decade and documents Myrtis' gradual transition from intimate work to operating a small tavern with Gaius. Financial support, but more than business partnership. Their letters reveal genuine care, shared observations about daily life, and mutual concern for each other's welfare. Myrtis wrote to Gaius about her fears of aging and losing her attractiveness. Guests responded with reassurances about her intelligence and business skills that went far beyond their original relationship. When Myrtis became ill, Gaius arranged for medical care and visited her daily. When she recovered, she named him in her will as her primary heir. Despite having living relatives in Greece, these personal relationships complicate simplistic narratives about exploitation and victimization in the ancient intimate trade. While the system was undoubtedly brutal and oppressive for many participants, it also created spaces where genuine human connections could develop, even across lines of social class, legal status, and economic power. The connections weren't limited to relationships between workers and clients. Evidence throughout Pompeii suggests that intimate workers often formed tight-knit communities that provided mutual support, protection, and friendship. The women who worked in Iris's establishment, for example, appear to have developed relationships that extended far beyond their professional duties. Graffiti in their living quarters includes inside jokes, affectionate nicknames, and references to shared experiences that suggest genuine camaraderie. One wall contains what appears to be a group poem, with different verses added by different women over time. The poem celebrates friendship, mutual support, and shared dreams of eventual freedom. When one of Iris's workers, a young woman called Secunda, became pregnant, the other women pooled their resources to ensure she received adequate food and medical care during her pregnancy. After the birth, they helped arrange for the child to be fostered by a family outside the intimate trade, giving the baby opportunities that would have been impossible if he had remained in the establishment. These acts of solidarity and mutual care weren't unique to Iris's establishment. Throughout Pompeii's entertainment district, archaeologists have found evidence of informal networks that provided support, protection, and alternative economic opportunities for people trying to survive within or escape from the intimate trade. The networks operated through a combination of business relationships, personal friendships, and shared cultural backgrounds. Women from the same regions of the empire often worked together and looked out for each other. Former workers who had achieved independence often provided opportunities for others who were still trapped in exploitative situations. Claudia Peregrina, a former intimate worker who had become a successful merchant, employed several women who were transitioning out of the trade in her fabric and cosmetics business. Her account books, preserved by volcanic ash, show that she paid above-market wages and provided housing and training that allowed her employees to develop skills for independent businesses. Claudia's success wasn't accidental. She had systematically built relationships with suppliers, clients, and other merchants that allowed her to create legitimate opportunities for women who might otherwise have had no alternatives to continued exploitation. Her business served as a bridge between the underground economy of the intimate trade and the legitimate commercial world of Roma and Pompeii. But Claudia's story also illustrates the constant challenges faced by people trying to escape their pasts. Despite her business success and social connections, she remained vulnerable to blackmail and social ostracism from people who knew her history. Several threatening letters found in her house suggest that former associates tried to extort money by threatening to expose her background to respectable clients. The psychological burden of maintaining a double identity took its toll. Claudia's private diary, written in Greek to conceal its contents from casual readers, reveals ongoing anxiety about discovery and deep sadness about the relationship she couldn't pursue because of her past. She wrote about watching respectable women her age marry and have families, while she remained isolated by circumstances beyond her control. Yet Claudia persisted, building her business and creating opportunities for other women, because she understood that economic independence was the only real protection available to people like her. Her success inspired others and demonstrated that escape from the intimate trade was possible with sufficient determination, skill, and fortune. The networks of mutual support extended beyond individual businesses to include entire neighborhoods and communities. The area around the amphitheater developed an informal economy that provided alternatives to direct participation in the trade while still serving the entertainment industry. Women in this community operated food stalls, sold souvenirs and gaming tokens, provided laundry services for travelers, and offered various forms of entertainment that didn't involve intimate services. The businesses were often owned and operated by former intimate workers who had saved enough money to establish independent enterprises. This alternative economy created a buffer zone between the legitimate business world and the explicitly intimate establishments. It provided opportunities for social mobility and economic independence while allowing people to use skills and connections developed during their time in the trade. The community also provided social support and protection that was unavailable elsewhere in Roman society. Women who had been rejected by their birth families because of their involvement in the trade found new families among people who shared similar experiences and understood their struggles. The bonds formed in these alternative communities were strong enough to survive even the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius. Bodies found in the amphitheater district were often discovered in groups that included people from different establishments and businesses, suggesting that when disaster struck, these informal communities came together to face death as they had faced life, supporting each other through the final crisis. But the eruption also revealed the ultimate fragility of all these human connections and social arrangements. The elaborate networks of relationships, businesses, and communities that people had spent years building were destroyed in a matter of hours. The careful social distinctions that had seemed so important were rendered meaningless by the democratic nature of volcanic ash, which buried rich and poor, free and enslaved, respectable and disreputable with equal indifference. The archaeological record captures this moment of universal vulnerability with heartbreaking clarity. In house after house, establishment after establishment, we find evidence of people who spent their final hours not according to social conventions or economic relationships, but according to the most basic human impulses for connection, comfort, and mutual support. The villa of Marcus Fabius Rufus, one of Pompeii's wealthiest citizens, contains the remains of the entire household, including family members, slaves, and several people who appeared to have been intimate workers from nearby establishments, who had sought shelter when the eruption began. In death, they were all simply human beings who had tried unsuccessfully to escape the same natural disaster. This democratic quality of the volcanic destruction creates a unique historical record that doesn't privilege the experiences of the wealthy and powerful over those of the marginalized and exploited. The ash preserved the stories of slaves as slaves and senators with equal fidelity, creating an archive of human experience that includes voices usually silenced by conventional historical sources. The preservation is so complete that we can sometimes reconstruct the final conversations and interactions between people who died together. In one small establishment near the city walls, archaeologists found evidence suggesting that a group of women spent their final hours comforting a younger colleague who was terrified by the volcanic activity. Empty wine cups and the remains of food suggest they shared a final meal, while trying to maintain hope that the danger would pass. The younger woman's body was found surrounded by small personal objects, jewelry, coins, and what appears to have been a letter from her family in a distant province. The other women had apparently helped her gather these possessions, ensuring that she would face death with reminders of the people and places that had given her life meaning. These final acts of kindness and solidarity remind us that even within systems of exploitation and dehumanization, people found ways to preserve their humanity and extend compassion to others. The intimate workers of Pompeii weren't just victims of historical forces beyond their control. They were complex human beings who responded to their circumstances with the full range of human emotions and behaviors, including remarkable resilience, creativity, and care for others. Their stories challenge us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual agency and systemic oppression, between personal responsibility and structural inequality, between the choices people make and the circumstances that limit those choices. They remind us that history isn't just about rulers and battles and grand political movements, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people trying to survive and find meaning within the constraints of their time and place. As we prepare to close this gentle journey through Pompeii's final hours, we carry with us the voices of people like Acelina, Tyche, Drusilla, Marcus, Fortunata Prima, and countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose stories have been preserved by the same volcanic forces that ended their lives. Their experiences illuminate not just the ancient world, but our own contemporary struggles with exploitation, inequality, and the commodification of human intimacy. They remind us that the fundamental questions about human dignity, economic justice, and social responsibility that we grapple with today are not new, but have been central to human societies for thousands of years. The ash that buried Pompeii also preserved these questions for future generations to examine and attempt to answer. As we continue to uncover and study the remains of this ancient city, we're not just studying ancient history, but confronting questions about human nature and social organization that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The voices that speak to us from beneath the volcanic ash remind us that the fundamental challenges of creating just and humane societies are not new, and that the choices individuals make in moments of crisis continue to shape the world long after those moments have passed. And so, dear traveler, as the night deepens and this story draws to its close, may you rest with the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there were always those who chose compassion over cruelty, solidarity over self-interest, and dignity over degradation. The people of Pompeii, in their final hours, showed us both the worst and the best of what humans are capable of. Their stories, preserved perfectly in time, continue to teach us about resilience, about the enduring power of human connection, and about the importance of remembering that behind every historical statistic was a real person with dreams, fears, and the capacity for both suffering and extraordinary courage. Sleep well, knowing that these voices from the past have been heard, that their stories matter, and that in remembering them, we honor their humanity and perhaps learn something about our own. Good night. This alternative economy created a buffer zone between the legitimate business world and the explicitly intimate establishments. It provided opportunities for social mobility and economic independence while allowing people to use skills and connections developed during their time in the trade. The community also provided social support and protection that was unavailable elsewhere in Roman society. Women who had been rejected by their birth families because of their involvement in the trade found new families among people who shared similar experiences and understood their struggles. The bonds formed in these alternative communities were strong enough to survive even the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius. Bodies found in the amphitheater district were often discovered in groups that included people from different establishments and businesses, suggesting that when disaster struck, these informal communities came together to face death as they had faced life, supporting each other through the final crisis. But the eruption also revealed the ultimate fragility of all these human connections and social arrangements. The elaborate networks of relationships, businesses, and communities that people had spent years building were destroyed in a matter of hours. The careful social distinctions that had seemed so important were rendered meaningless by the democratic nature of volcanic ash, which buried rich and poor, free and enslaved, respectable and disreputable with equal indifference. The archaeological record captures this moment of universal vulnerability with heartbreaking clarity. In house after house, establishment after establishment, we find evidence of people who spent their final hours not according to social conventions or economic relationships, but according to the most basic human impulses for connection, comfort, and mutual support. The villa of Marcus Fabius Rufus, one of Pompeii's wealthiest citizens, contains the remains of the entire household, including family members, slaves, and several people who appeared to have been intimate workers from nearby establishments, who had sought shelter when the eruption began. In death, they were all simply human beings who had tried, unsuccessfully, to escape the same natural disaster. This democratic quality of the volcanic destruction creates a unique historical record that doesn't privilege the experiences of the wealthy and powerful over those of the marginalized and exploited. The ash preserved the stories of slaves as slaves and senators with equal fidelity, creating an archive of human experience that includes voices usually silenced by conventional historical sources. The preservation is so complete that we can sometimes reconstruct the final conversations and interactions between people who died together in one small establishment near the city walls. Archaeologists found evidence suggesting that a group of women spent their final hours comforting a younger colleague who was terrified by the volcanic activity. Empty wine cups and the remains of food suggest they shared a final meal, while trying to maintain hope that the danger would pass. The younger woman's body was found surrounded by small personal objects, jewelry, coins, and what appears to have been a letter from her family in a distant province. The other women had apparently helped her gather these possessions, ensuring that she would face death with reminders of the people and places that had given her life meaning. These final acts of kindness and solidarity remind us that even within systems of exploitation and dehumanization, people found ways to preserve their humanity and extend compassion to others. The intimate workers of Pompeii weren't just victims of historical forces beyond their control. They were complex human beings who responded to their circumstances with the full range of human emotions and behaviors, including remarkable resilience, creativity, and care for others. Their stories challenge us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual agency and systemic oppression, between personal responsibility and structural inequality, between the choices people make and the circumstances that limit those choices. They remind us that history isn't just about rulers and battles and grand political movements, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people trying to survive and find meaning within the constraints of their time and place. As we prepare to close this gentle journey through Pompeii's final hours, we carry with us the voices of people like Acelina, Tyche, Drusilla, Marcus, Fortunata Prima, and countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose stories have been preserved by the same volcanic forces that ended their lives. Their experiences illuminate not just the ancient world, but our own contemporary struggles with exploitation, inequality, and the commodification of human intimacy. They remind us that the fundamental questions about human dignity, economic justice, and social responsibility that we grapple with today are not new, but have been central to human societies for thousands of years. The ash that buried Pompeii also preserved these questions for future generations to examine and attempt to answer. As we continue to uncover and study the remains of this ancient city, we're not just studying ancient history, but confronting questions about human nature and social organization that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The voices that speak to us from beneath the volcanic ash remind us that the fundamental challenges of creating just and humane societies are not new, and that the choices individuals make in moments of crisis continue to shape the world long after those moments have passed. And so, dear traveler, as the night deepens and this story draws to its close, may you rest with the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there were always those who chose compassion over cruelty, solidarity over self-interest, and dignity over degradation. The people of Pompeii, in their final hours, showed us both the worst and the best of what humans are capable of. Their stories, preserved perfectly in time, continue to teach us about resilience, about the enduring power of human connection, and about the importance of remembering that behind every historical statistic was a real person with dreams, fears, and the capacity for both suffering and extraordinary courage. Sleep well, knowing that these voices from the past have been heard, that their stories matter, and that in remembering them, we honor their humanity and perhaps learn something about our own. Good night.